Hi everybody. So my name's Tom. I'm currently the Chief Training Officer for a company called Positive Behavioural Support Cooperative, and I'm going to talk to you today about special educational needs coordination. So a little bit about me. Very old, flattering photograph of me. I've always worked with people with additional needs, and my initial reason for that was pure laziness, and it was for not booking myself work experience at school and getting the choice between going and working at Wimpy or going and working in a nursery. And I chose a nursery and then fell in love with working with children and additional needs, and it's kind of made my career. So I've got a degree in education studies. I was a teaching assistant at a special needs school, became a teacher, special needs teacher, then a special educational needs coordinator for mainstream school, consultant on learning disabilities and autism, and then got a master's in behavioural support. So that's a little bit about me. I do a lot of training and I try and make it as interactive and interesting as possible. However, this is about legislation and it's not going to be the most exceptionally amazing interactive session. So I apologise up front about that, but hopefully you'll take away some of the important parts about the legislation as well as special educational needs coordinating. So what is a special educational need? All of this is taken from the SEND Code of Practice 2015. So all of this is extrapolated from there. It's a 293-page document. So hopefully I'm going to pull out the bits that you need to know and you don't have to read the entire thing because it is onerous. So within that document it says that if someone has a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of their peers, or has a disability that means that the facilities are less accessible to that individual, that they would be recognised as having a special educational need. Doesn't need to have a diagnosis, nothing like that. You can identify someone if they need extra support. So you can identify people within a setting, within a school setting, if they're not meeting age-related, age-related expected levels within the school. So that within a school, it will say at year 5 you should be at this level. So if there's a major gap, then you might identify an educational need there and put something in place. Someone might have a diagnosis. If there's a failure to close an attainment gap as well, if that gap remains and that individual isn't progressing, keeping up. If you just talk to the young person or child, which is one of the best ways and one of the probably least used ways. So a big part of all of this, and I'll go into it in more detail later on, is about working with people and having them involved throughout the whole process and not being professional-led all the time. Just an important part, so pupils should not go backwards with their attainment. And I've worked in settings where pupils' attainment goes backwards and they say it's because of special educational need. That shouldn't happen. So if that's happening and you're seeing that within a setting, there needs to be a very, very good reason for that happening. And something like a bereavement or a medical condition where the individual is out of school for a very long time, things potentially like brain damage or seizures or things like that, then there may be a reason. But attainment shouldn't go backwards because you can't unlearn things. So yeah, that's a big red flag if you see that anywhere. So what are the areas of need? We've got communication interaction, which covers speech and language difficulties, as well as things like ASD. It's cognition and learning, so different ranges of mild, severe, profound learning disabilities or difficulties, and then specific learning difficulties such as dyspraxia or dyslexia or dyscalculia. Social, emotional, mental health issues, and then sensory or physical needs. So this could be visual impairment, a physical need, multisensory impairment, so that could be partial blindness, partial deafness. So what is a SENCo? So Special Educational Needs Coordinator, all mainstream schools have to have one, bar further education. They need to have a master's level accreditation, completing 3 years of becoming or being chosen to be the SENCo or agreeing to be the SENCo. They need to be a qualified teacher. That's a big important one. You will see in some settings that they say, oh, this is our SENCo, and it's someone who's not qualified as a teacher. Schools can't do that. It has to be a qualified teacher. They'll have a special educational needs or disability register. So that will have a list of people that they are responsible for watching their progress, making sure that interventions are put in place. And it may be full-time if you've got several schools or a very large school, or it may be part-time. So there's likely going to be teaching responsibilities as well. They may have multiple roles. So when I was a SENCo, I was a SENCo that looked after children's officer, safeguarding officer. You might be a head teacher or a deputy head teacher. You likely will have other responsibilities as well. And that can make a lot of sense because looked after children may well be on the SEN register as well, because they might need support with their education. I said cannot be a staff member without qualified teacher status. So again, if you're in a setting and that person isn't a teacher but they're called the SENCo, schools can't do that. Some schools try to do that, but they should not do that. So they can instigate or support an application for education, health and care plans, so an EHCP, so that is additional funding for an individual who has very targeted needs and requires more resource to support that person. A lot of the SENCo's time is spent doing EHCPs applications. You'll be likely in charge of annual reviews for that person, so yearly reviews of the EHCP and getting everyone in to review that, and tracking data and implementing evidence-based interventions as well. So the SENCo has a lot of responsibility, particularly around that SEND register. Those people who have been identified as needing additional support will go on the SEND register, and the SENCo will have overall responsibility for supporting the teachers, the staff, the individual in getting their needs met. So they're responsible for day-to-day operations of SEN policy and provision, liaising with other officers, so safeguarding officer, looked after pupil officer, advising on the delegated budget and other resources to meet pupil need. So the basic crux of an education, health and care plan is there is a nominal amount that is attributed to each individual pupil, which is around £6,000. And that's for teaching, staff, maintenance, food, everything within the school. If the individual need of that child outweighs that £6,000, then you apply for an EHCP to get additional funding on top of that. So you might be in charge of that budget and spending that on additional resources, depending on the setting. Liaising with parents of pupils of SEN, liaising with other professionals, multi-professional working, in charge of transitions to and from the school, working with head teachers and governors on reasonable adjustments. So there will be an SEND governor within each school as well that SENCo should be liaising with and working with, and record keeping for SEN pupils, which is all of their documentation as well as the overall SEND register. So these are all the additional bits of legislation that go around SENCo. So the main one is the SEND Code of Practice down the bottom, but all of these are either cited or work into the SEND Code of Practice. And a big important one right at the top is the Equalities Act. That's around reasonable adjustments, and that's around discrimination for people with disabilities. Well, one of the areas is disabilities. So the code applies to not just schools, but other institutions as well. So NHS trusts, clinical commission groups, CCGs, which are now becoming integrated care boards or integrated care partnerships, youth offending teams. It essentially covers anywhere that a child may be at any time receiving some sort of education. So this enormous document is an effort to create consistency so people know exactly what their responsibilities are around SEN, around SEND, and around supporting pupils within their settings. It should be about early identification, choice and control for both the individual, the families, the professionals around that person, raising the quality of provision, a focus on inclusion, and preparing for adulthood as well. So partnership working and co-production, as I mentioned at the start, co-production is a really important part of the code of practice and of anything you do within a school as a SENCo. So local authorities, CCGs and NHS must ensure participation of children, parents and young people in decision making, including commissioning of services, individual provision and operational outcomes. So within Norfolk, these are some of the advocacy services that work alongside NHS, work alongside Norfolk County Council to ensure that people's voices are more heard within things like commissioning, so when they're buying services. And some of them are here. So Dragons are part of NANZA. You've got Opening Doors, which is learning disabilities, Norfolk Autism Partnership, Family Voice, which are also here as well, and youth forums. So under the SEND Code of Practice, mainstream schools must consider applications from parents of children who have SEN but do not have an EHC plan, must not refuse to admit a child who has SEN but does not have an EHCP, and must not refuse to admit a child on the grounds that they do not have an EHCP. If a child has an EHCP, it is down to the preference of a young person or their parents whether they go to a mainstream school. And the mainstream school can't say no. That's the choice of the parent or the young person. Worth bearing that in mind if that's the choice that you're making, that a school cannot flatly refuse. Within special schools, generally you need to have an EHCP to be able to go to a specialist provision. However, there are some areas where it gets a little bit dodgier. So if someone's in a hospital and they only have SEN school provision on that hospital, they might go there because that's the only thing. And even if they don't have an EHCP, they still need education and they'll go to that school. If you have an academy trust where they have a policy and says you don't need an EHCP to come to our special school, that might also apply. But generally for specialist provision for special schools, you need to have an education, health and care plan. And as I said, the Equalities Act ties closely into everything that SENCos do. So one of the protected characteristics of the Equalities Act is around disabilities, and schools must not directly or indirectly discriminate, harass or victimise disabled children. They must make reasonable adjustments, and they must make reasonable adjustments proactively. So before that person even comes, they should be putting things in place to support that person. Reasonable adjustments is a lovely ambiguous term. A reasonable adjustment might be that all the Year 5 classrooms are upstairs, but there's a child who is a wheelchair user, so they move one of the classrooms downstairs. It would not be saying you have to put a lift in place for that one person, because that might not be reasonable, spending £50,000 on a new lift for an individual. However, it is reasonable to move the classroom to make it more accessible. They also must publish information to demonstrate compliance. So you'll find that in SEND policies, information reports, and that will be on the local office. So every single school must have an SEND policy and show how they're supporting pupils who have additional needs. So within Norfolk, this is Norfolk specific. This was a couple of years ago, this data is from. So universal support is everybody. So that's 83.6% of pupils within Norfolk receive universal support who don't require any additional intervention. You then have SEN support at 13.1%, and then the targeted support is 3.3%. So that's when we're looking at things like education, health and care plans. So as I said earlier, SENCo will work with occupational therapy, speech and language therapists, educational psychologists. There's a lot of services around SEND and to support SENCos as well, particularly here. And there might also be an SEND, like in Norfolk, professional community of practice. So that's where SENCos get together to share good practice, to continue their professional development and keep up to date with what's going on. So within SEN support, so just outside of Universal, it really labours the point within the code of practice that no amount of intervention can substitute for high quality teaching. So the onus is really on the teachers. So it might look like things like pre-teaching of key words, extra time, a visual timetable, differentiation, which is when you give children different levels of work depending on their need. Within my experience, schools overlook this quite a lot and give everyone the same piece of work and don't think to adapt it for people's needs, including people who find it very easy and people who find it very difficult. That's a really basic thing that you would hope to see within a school. And a good way of seeing that is just getting 3 different books, opening them all up and seeing if anything's different between them of varying levels. And again, reasonable adjustments. So seating arrangements, having potentially, you might have somewhere specifically for somewhere to sit if they have sensory needs, or if they have a visual impairment, they might need to sit close to the front of the class. Quiet and calm spaces as well. That's not seclusion, that is somewhere that the person has a choice in going if they require somewhere to calm themselves. And it's a taught skill, it's not you are going here, it's do you need to go there, and that person makes the choice, which is very different from exclusion or seclusion. So what it might look like in practice, so short frequent tasks, breaking tasks up, adapting the environment, so having it uncluttered, not sensory overloading. Again, schools sometimes have beautiful classrooms that are full of so much stuff that no one can concentrate. So it's about adapting it, making sure the environment is good for everyone's needs. As I said, quiet spaces, breaks, work is differentiated at the correct academic level for the individual. And a really important one is having positive relationships with staff, particularly the teacher who's within that room all the time with those individuals. And these are just some examples. So within SEN support, you might have something like a now and a next, a visual schedule to support someone in understanding what's going to happen after their current task. Or you might have dyslexia-friendly fonts within the classroom, or you might have different coloured backgrounds on your slides for someone who is dyslexic and requires a different font, different colour on the slides to be able to read easier. I mean, within my experience, all these things are very easy to put into place, but people don't necessarily know that they can do it, or they don't know that they exist. So it's a bit of it is just educating people and supporting people to understand what their options are and how they implement that within their setting, within their environment. Yes, so targeted support. So it's that child will still receive all the universal and the SEN support, and then we've got the targeted. So we are talking about pupils who have very specific needs. They might have a very wide attainment gap. They might have a diagnosis with some sort of disability. So you're looking at things like bespoke activities or bespoke curriculum for that person. You may apply for an education, health and care plan. Additional support, so you might have a one-to-one for that person, or a 1-to-2, or you might have support from someone like an emotional literacy support assistant, an ELSA, to make sure that person's needs are being met. And then you'll likely have a lot of other professionals involved around that person. So speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, educational psychology. And in practice, there's this plan, do, review, assess, plan, do, review cycle. And this is all about collecting data and making sure that the person's needs are being met and the things you're putting into place for that person are actually having the impact you want them to have. Because there's no good putting intervention in place and then just hoping it works. You have to assess, plan, do, review. You might use evidence-based interventions. And again, evidence-based, things that we know actually work, not just picking something out of a hat and hoping that it works. The day and curriculum designed around individual needs. There might be sensory circuits, there might be sensory breaks, there might be that quiet space. It might be agreed that that person only stays in the lunch hall for 5 minutes, and that's agreed, and that's measured with a sound timer, and that person comes out because that person has difficulties with that particular environment. And then that tightly monitoring data to evidence impact. And data is not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's so, so important to take on people to see that things that you are doing are actually working. So this might be academic grades, it might be attendance, it might be use of restrictive practice if that is within a school setting. It might be use of things like seclusion or exclusion, and monitoring those things to see if they're going up or down and what you're doing is actually supporting that person. So a little bit on education, health and care plans. This might be required if that person, as I said, goes over that threshold of £6,000 for their individual resource. It can be applied for by a parent carer. It can be applied for by a young person over the age of 16. A person acting on behalf of a school, so that might be a SENCo. Often it is a SENCo. But anyone can actually bring it to the attention of the local authority if they believe that an EHC assessment is required for that person. So it's not just professionals, parents and carers can apply themselves. It's a lot more difficult if you're not supported by the school, because the parent carer doesn't necessarily have the access to all of that data and things to evidence the resource required. But really, the school should be working alongside you. And it should take around 20 weeks from initial request to completion. Now, there's a bit of a caveat there that you have to collect all that information, that data, before you apply. So in the best scenario, it takes 20 weeks, but you'll probably have at least 2 terms worth of data you've been collecting to evidence the impact over time and say, yes, we still require all of this resource for this individual and look at the progress we're making, but we need to carry that on. So it's not quite 20 weeks. So information will be gathered for a needs assessment. So as I mentioned, things like academic attainment, rate of progress, evidence of physical, emotional, social development needs, things like the actions already being taken within the school. You can't just apply for an EHCP and say, well, we need more money to put things in place. You have to actually do it before you apply. And if a person's over 18, evidence of the additional time they may require for an exam, for example. The child or young person and their parent carers must be consulted and involved throughout the whole process. And that the information language used must be accessible to everyone as well. Again, in my experience, I find that if a child is non-vocal, if they do not use their voice to communicate, they are often a proxy will be put in place, so a parent carer or an advocacy service, or that individual will communicate, whether it's through their behaviour, through a different means, or whether that be BSL, for example. That person will be communicating, and you can still capture that if you look hard enough. So if an EHCP is usually completed by SENCo and put into place, that SENCo will monitor it and then will organise an annual review. So yearly, the professionals will come together, the parents, the person who's at the centre of that plan will come together to review it. So for an annual review, it must be accessible. Again, that whole accessible thing is really, really important. You can't ask someone to have an input into their plan if they can't read it, for example, or if you're using language that the person has no idea what you're talking about. And I know that that happens a lot with parent carers. So an interesting part within the SEND Code of Practice is you must not use only parent views as a proxy for the child. You should have advocacy for that individual, or collect, as I said earlier, collect those views through other means. So it can be things like taking a photo of someone enjoying an activity and using that to say, this is a person enjoying this. This is something we want to work more towards. This is a skill we want to build to improve their quality of life. But I found that quite interesting that you can't just use parent voice. You need to involve the person at the centre of the plan or have a proxy for them from an advocacy service. So for good practice for annual reviews, it should be a celebration. It shouldn't be everyone getting in the room and then saying, oh, this didn't work well and that didn't work well and hasn't done this. It should be a celebration of that person's life and achievements. Individualised for the pupils. So when I held annual reviews, I would always get their favourite squash, I'd get their favourite biscuit, and I'd put their favourite music on, and I'd go and find that information out from the person, and then they would come in and it would all be about them. So involve all relevant stakeholders, their teacher, their friends, the parents, the carers, the social workers, the occupational therapists. It is really, really hard to get all those people in the same room at the same time. It's often quite difficult just to get the teacher into the room for an annual review, because obviously you have to think about everyone else, but you want to get everyone there. Definitely the individual and the parents at the very, very least. And then ideally everyone involved in that person's care. So it also shouldn't just be led by the professional, by the SENCo. Often the SENCo will kind of chair it and say, oh, what do we think about this? Who wants to contribute to that? But in a really, really good annual review, it could be led by the person who the annual review is about. So when I used to do annual reviews, I used to put big pieces of paper up on the wall, say with what went well, what skills have we learned, and everyone would have post-it notes and they would fill them in, and I would take those, and that would become part of the annual review, that everyone's views were involved within the report that I wrote afterwards, because those are really important. They guided me in how to support that individual within the school as well. Information, advice and guidance. So if you are a parent carer, or you have anything to do with schools or SENCos, or your child has additional needs, you can get confidential and impartial advice, and that's within the Code of Practice again, that there has to be avenues that a local authority has to pay for an independent advocacy service. So in Norfolk, that is Family Voice. There's also SENDIAS, Special Education Needs and Disability Information Advice Support Service, I believe. There's the Youth Forums, Health Watch, and Pathfinder's Information Pack for really good examples of good practice that I've been using throughout this. Local authorities must provide accessible information freely available to young people and parents. So everywhere, every authority will have the local offer, which should show you everything within the county for the schools, for what activities are on, the SEND policies. The local authority website, again, all this is supposed to be very accessible, so anyone can use it and access it. Information on personal budgets and information on resolving disagreements and complaints, so mediation and potentially tribunals. So all of that should be accessible for people who are looking to support a young person and who can reach out for additional information around these different areas. Okay. Like I said, I'm so sorry that wasn't the most lively lecture I've ever given, but hopefully there's some useful information for you guys there, for people that you're working with. Are there any questions from anyone? No. Yes?
What's the most awkward or difficult aspect of your role?
As a SENCo,
Yes.
I would probably say trying to make cultural change. So when I've gone into schools before, people go into those professions because they're really passionate and they really care. When you go in as a specialist for and as an advocate for children with additional needs, and the teacher is pulling their hair out and they don't know what to do, and this child is doing this thing, blah blah, and you have to try and explain, well, actually you need to adapt your approach, you need to think about how you differentiate, how the classroom looks, how you respond to that. It can be taken very personally because those people care, and you're questioning how they're performing. Over time, when you give enough of support, when you, again, really boring, but when you collect data and you show the impact that it's having on that individual, when you evidence that, generally staff are more willing to accept what you're saying, but initially it's quite difficult to get that cultural change, to see it as, I need to adapt my approach opposed to that child needs to change for me. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'd say that's the trickiest bit. I was about to say working with parents, but actually it isn't at all. But when I was a SENCo, I put a lot of time and effort into my parents. I wanted them to have faith and trust in me and in the school and within the staff working with their children. In my first SENCo job, I went in and there was a lot of very upset parents, and rightfully so, because it wasn't meeting their children's needs. And I thought, when I first went in, oh, this is going to be the really, really tricky bit. But it wasn't. As soon as I started building trust and relationships and rapport and started giving those parents more of what they needed, they were a dream. They really, when they realised that we were on the same side and we were trying to do the best for their child, rather than seeing it as this fight between school and parent, it was amazing. And that was all because of co-production. That was all because we supported one another and we built that rapport. But I also know of instances where that can be a tricky area when a parent carer wants what's best, but then you can be limited by what you can do within the school, or other professionals don't necessarily agree. So yeah, it's culture change. It's working with caring professionals and trying to help them and support them to adapt their approach is probably the most difficult thing. Thank you for your question. Hi.
To what extent are teachers, just NQTs, given tools or knowledge to identify where to come to you, basically?
In my teacher training, we didn't have anything on special needs. I had an interest in it and I got a placement at a special needs school. Oh no, that's not quite true. I think it was half a day in a special needs school, and that was it in a year's training. When in my first job, I didn't even know what a SENCo was. No one said that there was this thing called a SENCo in the building. Then subsequently became one myself after being in special schools. So not a lot.
Is this recent as well?
I'm hoping it's better.
Yeah.
I don't know if it is. It would be interesting. You don't think it is? No. Yeah. So teaching is a big job. So it's all encompassing. It is a vocation. It is not just a 9 till 5. When you're a teacher, you are working constantly over summer, over everything, and that's just for children. You're 30 children who you're trying to get to progress. And then when you have a child who might have additional needs, if you don't have any of that knowledge, if you don't know what's out there, if you don't have those skills to equip you to support that person, it becomes very much they're the problem opposed to I might need to upskill myself. And again, that's where I was relating to earlier. That it's really hard because as far as I'm aware, there still isn't much training within courses for teachers around how to support people. And then someone becomes a SENCo and doesn't necessarily have that. they have the Masters of Accreditation and they go on that. But the only reason that I could make a difference when I was a SENCo was because I had all that experience of being a special needs teacher. I really understood need. And I was very used to making things bespoke for individuals to work into their need. Mainstream, it's not so much like that. So yeah, there's probably a good amount of work to be done in supporting teachers in understanding more around need. Sorry, it's a bit doom and gloom. But that's the point of a SENCo. The SENCo is there to train the teachers. They are there to do CPD, to go in, to observe, to support. And that's why you have to have that additional qualification. I don't know whether it's enough. I think more time spent in SEN schools, working with a wide range of children. I think that I feel like from my own experience, that's what made me a more successful SENCo, that I had all that backing behind me.
It's helpful to know as a parent to what extent I can just trust until
It will be down to individual teachers as well. There will definitely be teachers out there who have a really, really good knowledge. They might have children themselves who have additional needs. They might have additional needs themselves. But there will also be teachers that don't have that experience and will need a bit of additional training, a bit of extra support to know that. And there's loads of stuff out there, particularly in Norfolk. If you go on a local offer, there's tons of services that can support you, that can support educational settings. There's in fact a whole new service that's just being created, working specifically around SEN and schools and communities in Norfolk. Really quite a big project. So things are starting to change a little bit more, which is super. Anything else? Oh, thank you for your questions. I'm really pleased that you're still awake after that. I think that's me done if there's no other questions. I'm happy to wait around, and if anyone wants to ask anything else outside of this, I'm more than happy to talk to you, but thank you ever so much for coming.